Okay, welcome back, guys. So in the last video, we discussed chapter 5, the third Mishnah, about Avraham's 10 tests, and we understood it. We looked at it from the perspective of Rabbi Nassan, who was a Tana, and an Av Beis Din, the head of the court, and he presented the 10 tests as each test kind of juxtaposed against different parts of life. And his idea primarily was to bring out, as we discussed, this floor plan idea or a generational approach, that a person has to grow themselves, but the purpose of that growth ultimately is for the benefit of future generations, which they'll never see. 5, 6, 7, 10, 20 generations in the future, who won't know their name. And that was the idea of Rabbi Nassan. The Rambam, and what we're going to discuss in this video, is a completely different idea. Okay, it's related, but it's different. So the Rambam is a rationalist, a logician. He wrote this commentary when he was 20 years old, or in his 20s, excuse me. And so his Rambam is very particular, and he has 3 rules basically that he incorporates. In other words, in order for these 10 tests to count, the Rambam only counts basically the verses recorded. He lists everything in chronological order, and everything escalates. Okay, and then from the Rambam's perspective, a test is a demonstration. It's not an experiment. Meaning, God knows the outcome of a test, right? So what's the purpose of the test if God already knows the outcome, right? And so the answer is that the challenge or the nisayon is related to a nes, meaning related to the miracle. In other words, God does not test us to discover. He doesn't give us these trials to figure out if we're going to be successful or not. The purpose of these trials is to actualize our potential and to raise a visible standard for the entire world. So the Mishnah says explicitly the tests were given to make known how great was the love of Avraham. So on the Rambam's reading, your tests are not God finding out who you are, right? They are how who you are becomes real and becomes visible. So the Rambam is very logical in his approach. So the first test, chronologically, is Lech Lecha. Avraham has to leave his home, right? At 75, Avraham was told to abandon his land, his birthplace, and his father's house for a destination God would not name, the land that I will show you, okay? And the idea here is that the first recorded test is surrounding security and identity for a promise with no map. The Rambam notes the wrench of it, leaving everything familiar on the strength of a word. So Hashem's word is what Avraham is banking on. Avraham is totally trusting Hashem. He says, leave the land. I'm not even telling you where to go. It's going to be good. Avraham says, okay, I'm going to go. I trust in you, Hashem. In other words, so today, every person faces moments where growth requires leaving the familiar, leaving a community, leaving a career, a version of themselves, without knowing exactly where that road leads. And the test is whether you will move while the destination is still unnamed. Meaning, you're never going to know what's needed of you or where you're going to have to, because things are going to evolve. And that's the idea of that, being in the mindset of going into the unknown constantly and knowing it's going to work out. That's the idea. So question asked is like, what are you familiar with? What's familiar territory? What's not a good habit? What's a habit, a role, maybe a crowd of people that's keeping you the same, that's keeping you back, that's holding you back? You know, ask yourself, am I demanding to see the destination before I take one step? You know, when did I last leave anything for the sake of something higher? Ask yourself these questions, and hopefully you'll come to the right conclusion. So the second test is the famine. And the test, as the Torah records it, straight up. So immediately upon arriving in the promised land, what happens? A famine breaks out, and Avraham is forced to leave. So Avraham leaves, and where does he go? He goes down to Egypt. So the idea here is that the test, it lies in the apparent contradiction. God promised this land, then made it uninhabitable. So Abraham went down without complaint and without concluding the promise was false. So today, sometimes we have a setback, okay? And then a person arrives at the conclusion that they made a wrong commitment. No, you had a setback right after a commitment. That's normal. That's totally normal. That's what happens. You make a commitment, you realize it's going to be tough. However, you finally take the leap and things immediately get worse and worse and worse. So what are you going to do? Are you going to decide the promise was a lie, your commitment was a lie, or are you going to hold through and find sense in something that makes no sense? Okay. Are you going to find sense in something that makes no sense? Meaning, okay, you're told to leave your land. You go to a place where you think you're supposed to go, and then you find out there's a famine there. So then you have to transition. You got to move on. So just being open to transitioning constantly is one of the ideas to strongly consider as you go on your journey in life and through some of these tests personally. The third test is Sarah was taken to Perkei. In other words, his wife, Abraham's wife, was literally seized by the most powerful man of the time. And no effort, nothing Abraham could do could retrieve her or get her back. No merit of his, zero. He was completely helpless, completely powerless. So that's the question, that's the test. So a test of total helplessness, where no merit, nothing he can do to change the outcome. And ultimately, everything depended on trust. And meaning deliverance came entirely from heaven. Trusting in Hashem actually brings out the result of God delivering. A lot of people don't realize this is one of the fundamental ideas of Judaism, is that when you trust in God, and trust means you know it's going to happen, and calmly, you can go to sleep on it, knowing that God will deliver. When you have that trust, then it actually happens. If you think it's not going to happen, or you get nervous and do something negative, God forbid, you might prevent what's, if you were with trust, should have happened or could happen. And that's the idea, to ask yourself, when you're, God forbid, in a place where you have no control, what are you going to do? And so the idea is to be patient and stay the course and realize that you have to keep going and keep digging, and ultimately things will work out. They always do. The fourth test is the War of the Four Kings. And the test is the Torah, again, just as the Torah records in chronological order. So when Lot was captured, Abraham, who was by definition a man of kindness, he wasn't a soldier, but he pursued the region's superpowers with 318 men, as we discussed. He rescued Lot, and then he refused the spoils, meaning when he won the war, when Abraham won the war, he didn't want to take any of the financial benefit. And that's a really important point, because when you go rescue family, like Lot in this case, family who abused you, hurt you, called you this, lied to you, mistreated you, and did anything possible to break your trust. However, that family member, you go and you spend your money and resources. And when you do so, the goal of that is not to do it for money, not to get some kind of benefit. That's the idea of Abraham refusing the spoils, specifically in this war, because to show it wasn't about the money, it was about family. It was to rescue his nephew, it was to rescue Lot. So, question to ask yourself is, are you willing to be loyal to people even though they treat you badly? Would you be willing to consider rescuing them anyway? And not to convert that rescue into some kind of status or leverage against them, okay? But really help that person out not for the money, not for the status, not for the glory, but simply for that person in a true way, like Avraham did. So ask yourself, who in your life maybe is captive, in trouble partly of their own making, and maybe you kind of wrote them off, right? Maybe you could do something to help them. And if you act boldly, are you doing this for trust, out of trust in Hashem, or are you doing this because out of self-regard, out of trying to make yourself something for the sake of leverage or external benefit from another, right? If you fight with people, and to ask yourself, what did you gain from fighting with someone? So you can either keep fighting with someone or you can go rescue them. And the question is, what are you going to do? And when you do rescue them, don't look for fanfare. You're better off. You'll feel better about it. Don't say, I told you so and all that. On the contrary, ignore it. Focus on your goals. And that will be the best example for that person in the most meaningful and most dignified way. So the fifth test is marriage. So marrying Hagar for Avraham proved to be a wild challenge in the sense that Sarah was childless for decades, right? So Sarah herself proposed to Avraham that take a maidservant and build a family. So this was Sarah's idea to marry Hagar. It wasn't Abraham's idea, okay? So Avraham said, okay, Sarah, if this is what you want, I'll do it. So he accepted. And so this is kind of unique to RAMBAM'S list in the sense that the test of accepting a painful, complicated compromise of his own hope, right? Building the future through a path. That's not what he was promised. He was promised the child through Sarah, not through Hagar. But he accepted it without bitterness toward God or Sarah, okay? So this is the idea that a test of a life unfolding differently than maybe you prayed it would. And what happens when that happens in your life? Are you going to build faith within that reality? Or are you going to just slowly build resentment for the version that you kind of wished it was or wished you ordered? So the question is, when you're in a family, in a marriage, things don't always go how you think they're going to go. However, the key is sometimes you have to know when to get away and when to be quiet and just do what your wife wants. Sometimes it's a challenge, and not only is it sometimes a challenge, but it requires a lot of patience, because ultimately Avraham did have a child through Sarah, and it took a long time, and it took a lot longer than Avraham wanted to happen, because I'm sure Avraham had a different version of his life that would have been more suitable for his kind of how he wanted things to be. However, that's not how it happened, and it's not what Hashem wanted, how Hashem wanted it to happen. So for the sixth test, the bris milah, that's the next thing in chronological order. And the idea here is that Avraham is a bris at 99. So what's going on here? So he's commanded in old age to circumcise himself, right? Circumcision is painful, it's permanent, and it's actually public, even though it's private, but it's public. At his age, it was a public thing, and it marked him irreversibly different from the surrounding world, meaning he was permanently identified as different through the bris. That's what a Jew is. When someone sees a Jew with a yarmulke, with a beard, with tzitzis, we identify ourselves in this way, and our surrounding environment responds in kind, that they identify us in this way because we hold to these standards. And this is not only what Hashem wants of us, but it brings out the best in us. It allows us to live an amazing life. And it's scary, because who wants to get a bris at 99? Would you get a bris at 99? So this is a test of visible embodied commitment undertaken when he was even just long established, and he was entitled to coast. I mean, he didn't have to do this. He's already gone through so many tests. Why this test? This is Abraham could have said, I've gotten through enough already. Another test, and this test is even bigger challenge than the previous challenge. So Abraham took on this perspective that he's doing this for future generations. And that gives us the strength to succeed in things for family that we don't necessarily want to do. If we think about it in a short time frame, then we're probably may or may not do it, or you're going to be very upset about how things look. However, when we look on a longer time frame, so then we realize things are going to work out better than we can imagine if we look at a future perspective and not a short-term perspective. So the question to ask yourself, of course, private values are comfortable, right? And especially a world where everything is visible, right? Observance that shows standards that are inconvenient, that Judaism could be very inconvenient. But at the same time, it's also a refusal to say that at my stage I'm past change, meaning you're always in the mindset of growth. And that's part and parcel with standing out. So when you stand out, it kind of forces you to be in the zone or the version of growth. Because when you don't stand out and you fit in, so then no one talking to you, you don't stand out. So you're not under scrutiny. When you're under scrutiny, so you're on your best behavior. It's just human nature. So this is part of the dress, part of the body, that our bodies resemble something greater than our selfish needs. Our bodies resemble visibly something that stands to a higher authority, as they say. So questions to ask yourself are, does any commitment of mine cost my body anything? Comfort, appetite, appearance of normalcy? What am I refusing to change on the grounds that I am too established to change it? And would a stranger watching a week of my life detect what I claim to believe? So be honest with yourself and allow your best self to come through your body, in the sense that you visibly represent godliness. And people see that and you stand out. So how are you going to deal with that? And knowing that you're a leader and that all eyes are on you. Are you going to stand up to the challenge like Abraham did and get the bris at 99? Or are you going to say, oh, woe is me, I've already won through so many challenges, I don't want to do any more challenges? And finally, the seventh test is when Sarah is taken by Avimelech. So here, years later in Gerar, the same trial returned. Basically, his wife was seized by a king, and Abraham was again powerless. So passing a test once doesn't mean you're retired from that test. Actually, you should expect that test is going to come about again. And the Torah is teaching us from our forefathers, from Abraham, that the repetition, which Rambam is bringing out here as its own test, arrives with the special exhaustion that I already did this. That's the whole point. You're going to have another test where you're going to say to yourself, why is this happening to me? I already went through this. I already did this. Okay. That's going to happen. The recurring struggle here, the flaw conquered in your 20s that reappears in your 40s, the second withstanding counts in heaven's ledger no less than the first. So keep that in mind. You will most likely encounter the same challenges over and over and over and over. Expect that, and expect to get better at them each time, knowing that you will succeed, and you will succeed better and better every single time. As long as you continue, and even if you fail on your second try, your third try, you know what? You'll get better and better as you go. And on your fifth try, it'll feel like a cakewalk. So don't let constant struggles demoralize you. Realize that each victory builds, and the victories ultimately get to a place where your confidence level rises, and it's easier to overcome these challenges to the point where they don't even feel like a challenge anymore. And you transform this experience into something very godly. And even though it seems crazy, it becomes somehow joyous. So the eighth test is sending away Hagar. And God told Abraham to listen to Sarah and send Hagar from the household against his own inclination. So he was acting rightly when it contradicts. So let me say that again. Acting rightly when it contradicts your own compassion, when the correct thing is the thing that pains you, that's the correct thing to do, it's the hardest thing to do sometimes. And kindness itself is not enough. It actually has to yield to a truer obligation, which from Abraham's perspective, being kindness, he had to completely transform himself. That's not what was needed right now. It's not about kindness. It's about fulfilling a deeper obligation of what's needed of you. And it didn't feel kind, even though it really was kind, ultimately. So the idea today is that the boundary enforced while it still hurts, meaning the arrangement that mercy built and mercy must now dismantle. So sometimes you're doing things and you're doing something out of mercy and kindness, but that same situation which you initially treated with mercy and kindness needs to now be treated with a certain severity and discipline in order to accomplish what's needed and do the right thing. So ask yourself, is there a right thing I'm not doing because it would hurt me to do it? When I do hard things, do I deaden my heart so they stop hurting me? Can I hold, quote unquote, this pains me and this is right at the same time? That's the what we learn from here, is that oftentimes what's right is painful, and we don't like that. No one likes that, but that's the reality. And so finding that inner strength is essential sometimes to do that. But we can lean on the right people in the same way that Abraham leaned on his wife, and he did what she asked, and he trusted her, and it ultimately was the right thing to do. The ninth test is sending away Yishmael, which the Torah records was a very difficult thing for Abraham to do, because banishing not only Hagar, but his own son, whom he loved, so that matter was very bad in Abraham's eyes because of his son. Banishing his wife was one thing, but when he had to also banish his son, that hit on a different level for Abraham. But Abraham knew that he had to do it for his other son, and ultimately it would benefited both sons. So the Rambam splits what others merge, meaning losing Hagar and losing Yishmael were two distinct heartbreaks, and each its own test. Grief isn't generic, and each goodbye is examined on its own. In other words, the Hagar situation, the wife and the son, are two individual situations that need and to be treated individually and given the right time and respect, to acknowledge that pain and grief, and to set that boundary to do the right thing. The question is, the agonizing decisions that we all have within our families, sometimes a separation accepted for the sake of what must be protected. The rarest strength is the kind exercised against your own heart. And that is just, it's a big ask to go against your heart, especially if you do it twice. So Ask yourself, am I lumping my losses together to avoid feeling one? Is there a hard family decision I'm deferring because the last one already cost me so much? Do I believe God counts each of my quiet griefs separately, as this list kind of implies that each grief is separate, or is you think God just is just trying to, lump them all together? So think about these questions and ultimately realize that doing the right thing also requires room for grief. And if you need time to grieve a situation, it's important to give space to grieve each individual situation, not lump them together. In other words, Hagar situation needed grief as one situation. Yishmael needed grief as another situation. You couldn't lump them together. It needs to be separate in order to achieve full wholeness, full completion, in a sense, full remedy to do the right thing. And the 10th test is the Akedah, of course, the binding of Isaac, the famous story that we read multiple times a day. And this test is the culmination from RAMBAM'S perspective, because the command that seemed to annihilate every promise and every value God had taught him. God says Avraham rose early in the morning. In other words, Avraham was promised everything that ultimately he would benefit. The result would not be seen in his generation, and he would have to do the opposite and sacrifices, or do the opposite seemingly by going to have to sacrifice his own son. So God is telling him to do the opposite of what he promised. So here we see that Abraham's trust in God, quote unquote, appears to Abraham, or could appear that God is changing his mind. God's not changing his mind, but it could appear that way. But the point is, Abraham had such trust that it says Abraham rose early in the morning. So his commitment was first thing in the morning. This is what Hashem wants. I'm going to do it. Not, I'm going to delay it. Maybe I'm nervous about it. No, this is what Hashem wants. I'm for sure going to do it. And this is a very deep idea and a very challenging idea. In the Moreh Nevuchim, which is a famous sefer from the Rambam, very controversial sefer, the Rambam singles out the Akedah as teaching two things for all time: the outer limit of love and fear of God, and the certainty of prophecy. For Avraham would not have acted on anything less than the absolute clarity. Okay. In other words, the test was the surrender of his own understanding, sustained across a three-day journey, deliberation and not impulse. So imagine someone asks you to do something based on a promise that you believe in that promise, but to get there, it doesn't make any sense to you. You have to surrender the way you think about that situation in order to get there. In other words, consciously relieving control of how you understand the situation, which seemingly that's required of us, right? To try and understand our situation, to try and figure it out. But here, the whole test is that Abraham had to go beyond his understanding. And he didn't do it in an impulsive way. It's not like he did it in an hour. No, it says he went on a 3-day journey. So a 3-day journey is enough time to deliberate, to think it through, to process it, to make a non-impulsive decision. So today, no one faces this test literally, of course, and the tradition insists actually no one will. However, it is kind of like a shadow form, meaning the moment when doing right demands the very thing you believe the right path existed to protect, it's reverence decides, meaning choosing God over choosing your understanding is ultimately the decision that is the right decision, which is very difficult, nonetheless doable. So some questions to ask yourself. Is there a ceiling on my commitment? Something I would refuse even if certain it were asked of me? When an obligation makes no sense to me, what do I actually do? Do I comply resentfully? Do I refuse it quietly? Or do I get up early and do it? Ask yourself, what is my Yitzchak? What is the gift I would struggle most to hold with open hands? Very deep question. I'll say it again. What is your Yitzchak? What is your gift that you would struggle most with to ultimately hold with open hands and appreciation of that struggle? So let's finalize, and I'll leave you with this, that from the Rambam's perspective, this is a staircase. It begins with departure and ends with total surrender. And no step is skipped. The man who left Haran was not yet the man who could rise early from Moriah. 9 tests stood in between, and each one training for the next. The practical corollary: treat today's trial, however small, as preparation. Because in the Rambam sequence, nothing is wasted and nothing arrives out of order. And remember his definition. A nisayon, a challenge, is not God's experiment. God knows the outcome. It's a banner, meaning it's the mechanism by which latent greatness becomes actual and visible to make known to the world. Your difficulties are not evidence of abandonment. They are the only material out of which a self is built in public, which is why the Mishnah concludes that the 10 tests exist to make known how great was the love. The Rambam's last word on the subject is the Mishnah's own, the Adam Bechulam. He withstood them all. Not enjoyed, not understood, withstood. That is the entire achievement, and it is available at every scale of life. Thank you.